Hello and welcome to the CPUC's technical assistance video regarding the BEAD program, updating guidance regarding the design of the program, including project areas and negotiations. My name is Joanne Hovis. I am part of the contract team supporting the CPUC with the BEAD program, and I'm going to be presenting this content in this video over the next 45 or 50 minutes. The agenda for today is that I am going to describe project area design and how applicants can combine different project area units into a project area that aligns with and is compliant with the rules that the CPUC has adopted for the BEAD program. Then we're going to move on to the alternative percentage of 90% that the CPUC has adopted to enable applicants to offer alternative pricing for each of the project area units in its application. We'll do an overview summary of the way that the program is designed for purposes of the process, and then talk in some detail about what negotiations and the selection process will look like. As you have heard on all the technical assistance videos and webinars that the CPUC has provided regarding BEAD, there are two documents that are hugely consequential in determining what the rules and requirements of the BEAD program in California will be. The first is the decision that was adopted by the Commission for the execution of the BEAD program. And the second is the document known as the Initial Proposal Volume 2 that was submitted by the Commission to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce, known as NTIA. NTIA is the entity that was charged by Congress with overseeing all of the states and territories in administering the BEAD program. And the Initial Proposal Volume 2, or IPV2, was the proposal submitted by the CPUC to NTIA and then approved by NTIA for administering the BEAD program. So those two documents, IPV2 and the decision, are the two critical documents that any potential applicant should have at their side at all times in order to understand details regarding the rules of how the program will be administered. So let's start with project area design. The CPUC determined that a project area will be made up of project area units that can be combined by applicants as they see fit, so long as they are adjacent. I will come to the question of adjacency in just a moment, but let's start with what the project area units are. Again, project area units, smaller areas that can be combined into a larger project area for an application by an applicant. Under the CPUC's rules for the program, project area units are census block groups or tribal lands that can be aggregated, multiples, into a single application. And tribal lands, where they are not identical to census block group boundaries, will be the determining boundary. So tribal land boundaries will take precedence over census block group boundaries. As you all know, the project area units have within them, and the CPUC will provide data regarding what eligible locations there are in each project area unit, those eligible locations being unserved and underserved within the BEAD definition established by the federal government. So let's talk now about the adjacency requirement. As applicants combine project area units into a larger project area for a given application, those project area units must be adjacent to each other. If you decide to have project area units that you want to apply for that are far away from each other, you can still apply for them, but you must use a separate application. Any single application must be made up of adjacent project area units. Now, it's important to note what adjacency is defined as for these purposes. If a project area unit is right next to another one and they both have eligible locations, they can be combined. They are adjacent to each other. But if there is a project area unit, meaning a census block group or a tribal land area that do not have any eligible BEAD locations, those are considered to have no impact with regard to adjacency. What do I mean by that? Let me show you some illustrations that will hopefully make it easier to understand the adjacency requirement. So what you can see here is that this project area has 6 separate project area units, each of which has eligible locations. Those are the pink colored dots within each of these census block groups that have been combined into a 6 census block group project area. This is a compliant project area because it has 6 census block groups, each of which have eligible locations. They are adjacent to each other and they've been combined into a single application. Here is another illustration. In this case, we have 4 project area units that the applicant chooses to combine into a single application. Not all of these project area units are adjacent to each other as a physical matter, but there are other project area units, in this case, census block groups, that are intermediate between these that do not have any eligible locations. And for purposes of adjacency, the fact that there are those intermediate project area units with no eligible locations means that these are all defined as adjacent. So the adjacency is conveyed here by the fact that there are physically adjacent project area units that either have eligible locations or no locations whatsoever. What we don't have here is something that would violate the adjacency requirement, which would be an intermediate project area unit that does have eligible locations, but that the applicant chooses not to include. In that case, if the applicant tried to exclude that, that would be a non-compliant project area because there is an intermediate project area unit that would be required for adjacency that has eligible locations that has not been included in the project area, thus a non-compliant project area. And here is an illustration of exactly that. What you can see is this is a non-compliant project area that would not be acceptable for as a given application under the CPUC's rules. And that is because the 2 census block groups that or the many census block groups that the applicant is trying to include here are not entirely adjacent because there are intermediate census block groups that the applicant has not included that have eligible locations. If there were not eligible locations in those 2, then it would be compliant, but because there are eligible locations and we cannot exclude those from consideration, this is a non-compliant project area for a single application. Note, by the way, that these 2 separate project areas, as bordered by the thick yellow boundary in this illustration, could be submitted as 2 separate grant applications, but they cannot be submitted as a single grant application because they do not meet the adjacency requirement. In the context of tribal lands, as I said before, tribal lands constitute their own project area units. and they trump consideration of census block groups. Where there are tribal lands that are not adjacent to each other, but they are part of the same tribal lands, they are considered a single project area unit. So as in this illustration, these tribal lands could be included into a single application. They are considered adjacent for purposes of the adjacency requirement, and they could also include a single project area. A single application could include not just all of these tribal lands, but also the adjoining ones that have eligible locations. Let's talk now about another consideration and a key requirement of designing a compliant project area, and that is what we call the high need requirement. In the initial proposal volume 2 and in the commission's decision, there was adoption of a commitment that applications would have to include a certain minimal level of locations that have been defined as high need. And we'll talk about what that is in a moment, but it's locations that are identified as low-income areas or disadvantaged areas. In addition to the adjacency requirement that we just talked about, that has to do with where the broadband service, the eligible broadband serviceable locations or the eligible locations are located, this is a separate and additional requirement that is a necessary part of designing a project area. And what this is that wherever feasible, 50% of the project areas in any proposed project area must be high need, defined as high need by the CPUC. That is defined as low income or disadvantaged. We will show you through an illustration in a minute what that looks like. Now, in the event that there are no immediately physically contiguous high need project area units available for the applicant to add to a given application, in that event, if it is not possible to reach 50%, the applicant will be able to identify in the application that it is requesting a waiver, but it must, wherever there are immediately physically contiguous high need project area units around its proposed project area, it must include as many as possible up to 50%. If those are not there, if they do not exist, the waiver is possible, but so long as they do exist, they are mandatory requirements. And when I say do exist, I mean that they are immediately physically contiguous to the project area. Unlike with the adjacency question having to do with where there are eligible locations in a project area unit, the empty project area units or the project area units that do not have any eligible locations would not qualify. Those are not a consideration. They are not a factor in determining the high need obligation of up to 50%. And they're not a factor in determining the total percentage of high need project area units that must be included. So you see two separate analyses, both of them mandatory, but very different to each other. The first one is the one we talked about a few minutes ago about how the applicant assembles project area units into a project area, and that those project areas must be adjacent to each other or have empty intermediate project area units with no eligible locations for a single application. That was requirement number one. The second one has to do with high need areas, a completely different, but also necessary analysis in which the applicant must ensure that so long as there are immediately physically contiguous project area units that meet the high need definition, that are low income or disadvantaged, they are included in the project area with a waiver available for reducing that 50% number to whatever percentage is immediately physically contiguous. All right, what does that look like? Here is an illustration of what the project area would be with the required percentage of high need areas. In this illustration, the applicant is proposing to serve 10 project area units. 6 of them qualify as low income areas or disadvantaged communities. 4 of them do not. Given that the percentage in this larger project area is higher than 50% of low-income areas or disadvantaged communities measured here by census block group, this grant area, this proposed grant area or project area exceeds the 50% threshold and is thus compliant with the rules and can be submitted. So here is an example where there would actually be a need for a waiver based on the areas. In this example, there are 5 project area units that have been combined into a single grant area. Only one of the 5 has been designated, and you will see all of this, by the way, in the grants management system as you are designing your grant area. It will provide you information about this, so you won't have to guess at what area is low income or disadvantaged. But only one of the 5 qualifies as low income or disadvantaged for purposes of this particular grant area. That is less than 50%. That means that if there are immediately physically contiguous project area units, the applicant is obligated to add those up to 50% or higher if the applicant chooses to. But in this case, none of the immediately physically contiguous grant areas qualify as low income or disadvantaged. And as a result, this proposed project area would qualify for a waiver, and the applicant would then check the box in its application asking for that waiver based on the fact that it does not have the option of adding additional immediately physically contiguous project area units that are either low income or disadvantaged communities. Another but related consideration is that, as you all know, there were locations that defined by census block group, that NTIA, the federal entity that oversees the BEAD area, designated based on its own data and modeling are high cost. These were areas, census block groups, designated by the federal government, not by the CPUC, and not based on metrics that are publicly available. So there may be disagreements on what those areas should be, but please know that this is not something over which any state had control. This was determined by the federal government. These census block groups were designated as high cost. And for those census block groups, the federal government waived the match requirement for the BEAD program of 25%. That list is accessible, the list and the definition of high cost areas. Those locations are accessible through federal and state databases, and all of that is available to all of you. But for those particular census block groups, the match requirement is waived, and it will be possible for you through the grants management system as you are submitting your application to exclude that from your match obligation and your match requirement as submitted in the application, and that will be consistent with both federal and state rules for the BEAD program. Please note this high cost analysis with regard to the BEAD and project area design is distinct from the two other analyses that we just discussed, one of which was the high need areas up to 50% that are required to be included in the project area, and the adjacency requirement for combining adjacent project area units into a single grant application. Let's move on now to another consideration related to how you design your project areas for your applications. This consideration has to do with scoring. It is not a consideration in mandatory elements of how a project area for a single application gets designed. It's rather something that can impact how many points a given application is able to score based on factors that are related to project area design. I'm going to come back to this screen to talk about these in detail in a moment, but let me first show you. This is the scoring rubric as found in the initial proposal volume 2 for priority broadband projects, that is to say, end-to-end fiber. And the two factors we're talking about here, the two criteria for scoring, are equity and resilience, each of which will be awarded up to 10 points out of a total of 100 as part of the scoring rubric. These, by the way, are the two that the CPUC was able to select itself. All the others were mandatory federal scoring criteria. This is the rubric for end-to-end fiber or priority applications. And on the next slide, what we have is the scoring rubric for other last mile broadband deployment projects. That's federal terminology for other applications for terrestrial infrastructure that meets the federal government's definition of what a reliable broadband service is, but is not end-to-end fiber. So this is largely for hybrid fiber coax, licensed fixed wireless, hybrid licensed, unlicensed fixed wireless, and so on. And here again, as you can see, in the two criteria that were added by the commission, all the others were mandatory under federal rules. Equity and resilience each have 10 points for a total of 20 out of the possible 100 points for each application. Now let's go back to how these two things are scored and how they relate to project area design. With regard to resiliency, up to 10 points will be awarded to each application or each project based on how the proposed network would be resilient infrastructure. And the way the points will be awarded is that all applications for all areas are eligible to win these points by demonstrating resiliency. But for those locations in any given application that are located in a tier 2 or 3 high fire threat district, the threshold showing, the required showing with regard to resilience is higher. Stated otherwise, in order to win the points in a tier 2 or 3 high fire threat district, you have to show that much more resilience in the network design than in other areas that are not tier 2 or 3 high fire threat districts. And that is for up to 10 points. So you can see there how the way you assemble your project area of different project area units could have impact to your scoring depending on how you have designed your network and the level of resilience that is shown. Much more detail in the initial proposal volume 2, and also in the webinar that was presented earlier this year that was a deep dive into scoring. The second criterion, again for up to 10 points, has to do with equity. And here, this has to do with what the percentage of locations is in your proposed project area of low-income locations. The percentage of locations in low-income or disadvantaged community project area units relative to the total number of locations in your entire proposed grant area. So this is very different than the mandatory requirement to include up to 50% low-income or disadvantaged community project area units in your underlying design. This doesn't have to do with how many project area units you have. It has to do with how many locations are in low-income areas or disadvantaged communities in your project area as a total percentage of all of the locations that are in your project area. Again, considerably more detail in the initial proposal volume 2 and in the webinar that was conducted regarding scoring. And here we have an illustration of what the equity scoring will look like. As you can see on this map, while the percentage of project area units was the determinant of whether the project area was eligible to be submitted as a grant, a single grant application. The consideration of how many points are going to be awarded for equity is based on the percentage of locations, eligible BEAD locations within the entire project area that are in low-income or disadvantaged areas relative to the total number of locations in the entire application. Let's move on to the next issue, which is the alternative pricing for 90% coverage, or stated otherwise, the alternative percentage under which applicants may propose an additional pricing proposition for consideration for funding. So the CPUC has required that every application that is submitted must provide a price proposal to serve 100% of the eligible BEAD locations in the project area as it is assembled by the applicants. And we just spent the past half hour talking about how you can assemble those project areas. The CPUC is also allowing each applicant to submit as an additional, not an alternative, but an additional option, a price proposal to serve 90% of the eligible locations in that same project area. This will be in the same application. So in your application, you would say at 100% coverage, I propose X number of dollars. At 90% coverage, I propose X minus Y number of dollars. The application will be scored based on the 100% proposal, but there is a chance, there is an opportunity that if the CPUC does not identify a 100% proposal for a given project area that is fundable or affordable given the overall statewide BEAD budget, the CPUC may turn to those 90% proposals as an alternative and fund the highest scoring of those, or the highest scoring and affordable within the budget of those. Critically, in order to propose 90%, applicants will be required to identify those locations that they propose to exclude under the 90% service commitment. And the application in the grants management system in the portal will facilitate doing that to make it as simple as possible. So the information that would be required are a price at 100%, and then if an applicant chooses to, additionally, the applicant may offer a price at 90% and a list of the 10% of locations, or the up to 10% of locations that the applicant proposes to exclude under its 90% cost proposal. Associated with that, in addition to the list of applications and the cost, the applicant will also be asked for the revised matching fund commitment. And again, the grants management system, which will also have extensive technical assistance videos provided in the near future, will direct the applicant for where and how to do this in order to make it as simple as possible. So an illustration, here is the 100% proposal. It is 41 eligible locations in this project area, and the applicant will provide a proposed price and match given those 41, given a commitment to serve those 41 eligible locations. Here is the 90% proposal that the applicant may choose, does not have to, but may choose to submit as part of the same application, removing up to 10% of the total 41 applications, providing the cost at 90% and the match at 90%, and also providing the list of those 4 locations that in this illustration the applicant proposes to exclude. Okay, let's move on now to an overall summary of the total program design for the program. This is a topic on which other videos have been provided going into considerable detail, and I know many of you are aware of. We're going to go through this again here, and in addition, what you see on each of these slides are citations to the federal and other resources that govern what we are talking about here. I'm going to start here by talking about technology prioritization, and this is actually a graphic that was provided by NTIA, so provided by the federal government, that was part of the federal government's own guidance materials. And there is a link at the bottom of the slide if you want to see the entire slide. But what you can see here is that the federal government has identified as its top technology priority what they call priority broadband projects or end-to-end fiber projects. Second priority is what they call reliable broadband service qualifying broadband, which is hybrid fiber coaxial cable, digital subscriber line, and licensed fixed wireless or hybrid licensed unlicensed fixed wireless that meet the technical requirements of the BEAD program, which is 100 by 20 in speed and very low latency. And then as a last priority for those locations where no other option is available or affordable, the federal government is allowing states to fund what they call alternative technologies, which the federal government has defined as unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite. So there is the prioritization in descending order. What we have also, and this is again an NTIA diagram, is an overall framework that NTIA has offered, starting at the top left and working around following the arrows NTIA's simple way of communicating to states and to applicants of how it expects selection to go is that the submitted bids will be evaluated. If there are priority bids, meaning bids that are end-to-end fiber, and they meet the federal end-to-end fiber, and they qualify and are affordable, are within the total cost that is available for those areas, given the overall budget for the entire state, then they must be funded. So if it's end-to-end fiber, meaning a priority bid, and the cost is within what the federal government calls the extremely high cost per location threshold, just think of that as meaning, is it affordable given the need to reserve funds for the entire state and to have funding for every location? If it is affordable, then it must be funded. If it is not affordable, then the state may move on to considering, is there a reliable broadband service offer, meaning a reliable broadband service that is not end-to-end fiber, that is HFC or DSL or licensed fixed wireless or licensed, unlicensed hybrid fixed wireless. If there is an offer for that grant area of reliable broadband service, and again, if it is affordable, given the overall budget for the entire state, the allocation of funds that are available for the entire state, then the state must fund it. If, however, there is not a reliable broadband offer at that point, or there is not one that can be afforded, given the need to reserve funds for other parts of the state, then as a last resort, the state may fund alternative technologies, meaning unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite. So let me say that again, and apologies if I seem to be repeating myself, but the federal framework for what can be funded here under federal rules and under federal guidance, which you see linked right here, is if there's end-to-end fiber and it's affordable, it must be funded. If not, we can look at other terrestrial technologies that meet the federal government's definition of reliable broadband service. If that is affordable, it must be funded. If not, then the state may then select unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite. That is the prioritization. It means that there will probably be a mix of all these different types of technologies funded, depending on whether there is an application or more than one application. And depending on what the costs are and how affordable those costs are relative to the needs of the rest of the state. So what does all of that mean as a practical matter? Because that's a really simple, seems very intuitive, relatively straightforward graphic. But as you all saw from what we just discussed about project area design, is probably not quite that simple. So let's talk about what this will actually look like. And I am going to skip through these slides that have lots of words on them and go to the graphic that I think makes it somewhat easier to understand what the process will really need to be in order to effectuate that framework that was proposed by, or that was required by the federal government. And you all will have access to these slides and can look at all of the words on the slides, which come right out of the decision and out of initial proposal volume 2, so that you can dig in with more depth. But I am going to show you what this means as it has been approved by the federal government. And I'm using this graphic version because I think it's easier to understand the complexity of it. Please look at the initial proposal volume 2, look at the decision. Those are the Bibles of this program because those are the basis for how the program will be operated. But this is a graphic effort to simplify in order to explain how the program will work. So using the same framework that the NTIA graphic did, starting over here on the left, and hopefully you can see my cursor, what we will see is that the applications will be submitted, they will be scored, and then they will be ranked. And at the top of the ranking will be the priority applications, those that are end-to-end fiber. Below them will be, I'm going to flip through slides here. Below them will be the applications for other reliable broadband services, meaning hybrid fiber coaxial, licensed fixed wireless, hybrid licensed non-licensed fixed wireless, and actually DSL, so long as those applications meet the technical requirements established for the BEAD program, that is 100 by 20 in speed and very low latency. And then below that is alternative technology, or those locations that are, those applications that are for unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite, right? So that is taking the federal requirements for technology and looking at them in the order that the federal government required with regard to prioritization. Fiber at the top, then other reliable broadband services, and at the bottom, alternative technology, meaning unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit. So what happens first in looking at the priority or end-to-end fiber applications? Well, they will be scored, and then the ranking will be determined by the fact that they are fiber, so that they are at the top from a priority standpoint, and then based on score. The score will be the second element in determining their ranking. And then the CPUC will look at all the highest scoring applications on a statewide basis that do not overlap with each other, that do not have the same grant areas. So the highest scoring applications for different project area units that have been built into applications for project areas that are distinct from each other rather than overlapping. And the CPUC will evaluate based on those non-overlapping applications, starting with the highest scoring, if they are identical to each other, will consider whether, given the overall funds available, the overall allocation of funds for BEAD for the state of California, and the budget thus available for those areas, is this an affordable application? If time permits, and this is feasible within the statutory timeline that the CPUC has to get this process underway, if that application is not within that budget, there may be a negotiation to see if it can be brought within the budget. And if it cannot, and if the application is not within the budget, it may then be removed from consideration because it is simply too expensive. Despite the fact that it was high scoring, it was too expensive. If the application is within the budget, that is, the high scoring non-overlapping application is within the budget, it will then be set aside as preliminarily assigned, and the project area units in the project area proposed by in that application will be preliminarily assigned and removed from consideration for additional applications. That high scoring applicant who was within budget is going to be the provisional awardee there, subject to federal approval, which is going to happen right at the end of this process, hopefully. Okay, so those are the non-overlapping applications. Relatively simple analysis. Are they distinct? This is the top scoring application for these project area units. Is it affordable? If no, gets removed from consideration. If yes, it is affordable, it gets preliminarily assigned. Now, the next part of that analysis is which are the applications that do not that do overlap. And by do overlap, what I mean is that a higher scoring application has been considered, had certain project areas, and I describe things with my hands. If you can see the video, you're seeing me describing with my hands. The project areas have certain overlapping areas with someone who has already been preliminarily assigned those project area units. So for this overlapped applicant, some of what they propose to serve has already been removed from consideration for them. And what will happen then is that they will get an offer as the next highest scoring entity for the remaining areas. They will get an offer for whether they will be willing to accept that area, those project area units that remain at a price that the CPUC has determined is affordable given the statewide needs for BEAD funds. And if they accept, thus that project area unit is within budget, they will be preliminarily assigned those areas. If they cannot accept it because they do not wish to accept the reduced project area, with those project area units excluded, or they cannot do it at the price that the CPUC has available, their application will be removed from consideration and the CPUC will move on to the next application for those areas, the next highest scoring for those areas. So what does that process look like? That is now something that the CPUC will go through this process on an ongoing basis for every application that is received for priority broadband that can potentially be funded, meets qualifications and is affordable, and exhaust every opportunity to fund priority broadband, that is end-to-end fiber. When there are no more options for this and there's no more opportunity to fund these areas, the CPUC may elect other strategies in addition to that. It may offer applicants the opportunity to submit bids under other terms, and it may allow for revised project boundaries. Another way of saying this is the point at which the CPUC will consider, among other things, those applications at 90% of eligible locations with those alternative costs, alternative match, and the removed locations. And the CPUC has the opportunity, depending on the time available and the potential for additional value to be derived from the additional effort, to undertake these additional ways of considering priority applications in order to maximize the number of priority applications and the number of priority project area units and locations that get funded, to maximize the amount of fiber that is funded within the finite BEAD budget. And this will be undertaken in order to try to maximize fiber, and then to move on to step 2, the reliable broadband service analysis, going through exactly the same process with the applications that were received for reliable broadband service, that is to say, hybrid fiber coax, licensed fixed wireless, and hybrid licensed unlicensed fixed wireless, DSL, and so on, in order to now maximize how many locations and project area units are funded with the applications for reliable broadband service. And then finally, once that process is exhausted, as a last resort, moving on under NTIA rules and guidance to all of the remaining locations for whom there has not been a preliminary assignment because there was either no priority or reliable broadband service application, or there was no priority or reliable broadband service application that could be afforded within the state of California's overall BEAD budget. So either no application at all or no affordable application. For the remaining locations throughout the state for which there were no applications that could be funded, under NTIA's guidance, the CPUC will remove from eligibility those locations where there is already an alternative technology, such as unlicensed fixed wireless, that meets the BEAD program's technical requirements. And then for the others, look for applications that propose either low Earth orbit satellite or unlicensed fixed wireless and assign the remaining locations to the high-scoring applications of that sort in order to try to get to 100% coverage of all BEAD eligible locations within the finite BEAD budget, the finite BEAD allocation provided by the federal government for the BEAD program. That is a lot of content. We look forward to your questions and your comments. We look forward to recording many additional technical assistance videos of this sort for support to applicants as they prepare to submit their BEAD grant applications to the CPUC. Thank you all so much.